Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Um, we have a fabulous next panel that is going to focus on aquatic animals. And they are, of course, among the most unseen animals on our planet, with our four outstanding speakers who have been working quite hard to sort of change that. Our first panelist is Lori Marino. She is president of Whale Sanctuary Project and adjunct professor in Animal Law Studies program at New York University. Lori is going to be speaking on animal sentience, cognition, and the law. Thank you, Lori.
Thank you, Joan. It's just a pleasure to be involved with the encyclopedia and with this panel. So I'm going to share my screen and thank you very much again for inviting me to participate in this incredible project. It is so important, and I'm really honored to be here with my colleagues in so many of the important areas in animal law. Today, I wanted to sort of follow closely the entry that I wrote for the encyclopedia and then give you some updates on what's happening in the world of marine mammal legislation and advocacy and protection. It's pretty exciting what's going on right now. So, first of all, animal sentience and cognition, which was the focus of my entry, is really at the center of animal protection efforts. It's the understanding that other animals have minds, feelings, that things can be better or worse for them. That's really at the center of our advocacy. But often these topics are debated, they're fought over, and they're confused in legal and ethical argumentation. So it's really important to get it right. Proper understanding and use of scientific evidence is critical for effective legal and policy advocacy for animals. Now, the problem of captive cetaceans, dolphins, whales, and porpoises, is one I've been working on for many years now. And um, even though this is about all aquatic animals, the idea that captive cetaceans need advocacy sits squarely within the more general framework of non-human animal advocacy. So what I'm going to talk about now is more general about non-human animal advocacy, but then I'm going to return to dolphin and whale advocacy. So first of all, some definitions, and this is a work in progress. It'll probably always be a work in progress because you can ask 100 people what sentience, cognition, and consciousness is, and it will give you 100 different definitions. So in my entry in the encyclopedia, I try to, in some way, solidify some of these definitions. One, sentience, the capacity to feel or experience physically or mentally. So just the ability to have sensory experience. Cognition has more to do with intelligence, the capacity to think, to reason, memory, problem solve, the ability to organize and analyze information. And finally, consciousness, the awareness of being alive, including awareness of one's own existence and an autobiographical timeline. In other words, you know you're alive, you know you were you yesterday and you're going to be you tomorrow. And so you have a sense of your life. And again, these are all a work in progress because nobody living on the planet today has really figured out whether there's any way to nail down these three terms in any concrete way. So the next thing I want to do is take you on a whirlwind tour of historical milestones that have shaped animal advocacy. The first person I want to talk about is this guy, Charles Darwin. So his theory of evolution by natural selection really provided the empirical basis for mental continuity across species. He said the difference in mind between man and higher animals, great as it is, certainly is one of degree and not of kind. And so he set that foundation for advocacy based upon shared mental states across all species. But then this guy came along, B.F. Skinner. When I went to college, psychology or comparative psychology was all about running pigeons in Skinner boxes. That's what it was all about. This guy, Skinner, did some pioneering work. He promoted the notion of behaviorism, but basically that sidelined animal cognition and mental states in the early to mid 20th century. Behaviorism states that any scientific study of behavior must be based on observables and not inferred mental states. Only the relationship between how environmental factors influence behavior is permissible. So what B.F. Skinner did was he basically said it doesn't matter whether other animals have minds or feelings. All that matters is how the environment affects behavior. And we were there for a really long time, except this gentleman came along, Donald Griffin. So at the same time that Skinner was working, Donald Griffin's work was showing the limitations of behaviorism and opened up the field of animal cognition. In his seminal work in 1976, The Question of Animal Awareness, he advanced the idea that if Darwinian evolution is actually to be taken seriously, it must be acknowledged that minds and consciousness are distributed widely across the animal kingdom. So thankfully, Donald Griffin brought everything back to animal minds through rigorous scientific work. Presently, we know that all behavior is driven and shaped by thoughts and feelings. Behaviorism wasn't entirely wrong, but it missed the vast mountain of evidence for mind and other animals. In these times, it is accepted that humans are not the only animals with minds. The definition and study of cognition in non-human animals has really advanced in many ways. First, the study of sentience and cognition has expanded beyond mammals to non-mammals and even to invertebrates, including insects. Birds, fish, octopuses, and insects have demonstrated capacities formerly thought to be unique to humans, including problem solving, social learning, and play. Second, it is acknowledged that humans and other animals share a great deal of overlapping psychology and that humans are not qualitatively different from other animals. Excuse me. This is tantamount to the rejection of human exceptionalism. Now, that doesn't mean that everything is fine and we can all go home, but it is an acknowledgement that we need to do a lot more work. So with that whirlwind tour, the question is, how are these advances in our thinking shaped legal and other advocacy efforts for cetaceans, and specifically captive cetaceans, dolphins, whales, and porpoises, forced to live mainly in concrete tanks to perform? So there have been, in the past 10 years, a tremendous push and legal and policy advances in cetacean advocacy and protection. I'm just going to give you just a few of them because this is really incredible. Starting in 2016, SeaWorld ended breeding of orcas in captivity due to public and regulatory pressure. And then in 2019, Canadian Law S-203 was signed. It ended the captivity of dolphins and whales in Canada. This was at the time, and probably still is, the most progressive legislation for captive dolphins and whales in the world. In 2021, France prohibited the holding and breeding of cetaceans in captivity, so they followed suit. 2 years later, South Korea prohibited the new acquisition of cetaceans for captive parks. This is all legislation and policy. In 2024, Belgium, permanent ban on dolphinaria. And also the Dolphin Company, the world's leading holder of bottlenose dolphins for entertainment, closed their marine parks, and they have over 300 bottlenose dolphins that they are looking to rehome. This year, Mexico passed a nationwide ban on dolphin shows and swim with dolphin programs. And also, the Miami Seaquarium closed after repeated animal welfare complaints. So basically, the story is this, that the captive marine mammal industry is going down. But there's still a long road ahead. We can't let up. We need to create and enforce protective legislation, and particularly in having the rights of other animals legally recognized. I think that it's still important to have their rights legally recognized. Growing scientific evidence for sentience, cognition, and consciousness is making it more and more difficult to deny these protections to other animals, including invertebrates. So the future is promising. Let's keep going. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lori. That was really great and really helpful in terms of distinguishing among sentience, cognition, and the like. I mean, I think
Hope
many of
so.
us lawyers are still sort of often get confused with those various terms. So this was a fabulous presentation. Thank you. And all the great work that you're doing with the whale sanctuary. All right. So now we're going to turn to our second panelist, my colleague, Kathy Hessler. Kathy is the Assistant Dean of Animal Law here at the George Washington University Law School. And Kathy is going to be discussing aquatic animals.
Thank you, Joan.
Thank you.
And thanks to Lori. So this is, it's wonderful to follow Lori. I'm going to be talking about aquatic animals, sort of qua aquatic animals, just as a broad category, sort of who they are, what threats they face, the legal framework generically. I'm not going to cover much of the science because Lori did, and I'll talk about new ways of thinking. So first thing that we need to do when we're thinking about aquatic animals is see them, think about them, think about that. I call them our cousins, all animals are cousins. And so why are we even talking about aquatic animals specifically on this panel? Well, because they're important, they matter. They matter for themselves individually, they matter for their own species and species survival, they matter for the benefit of the environment, and that also helps us as humans on the planet. So they matter. But we don't see or really understand them. And this is true, more true for aquatic animals than it is for some other types of animals, because we literally can't see them, right? So literally, they're invisible to us because they're in spaces that we're not in. And that lack of interaction tends to result in a lack of understanding, which is a lack of empathy. And we need to care about these animals in order to want to protect them. We also need to care about the ones who aren't just the whales and dolphins and you know, charismatic ones, the turtles, the penguins. So thinking about who they are, beginning to really see them is important. The other thing that we have to take into account is people tend to think that they exist in uncountable numbers, that they're a vast and unlimited resource. And that's a problem we have to counter. And it means we discount the value of individuals. And it means we think we can exploit these animals and there won't be a problem, right? The we sort of generically. So we need legal protection against the regulation and abuse of these animals and to begin to see them as valuable for themselves. So who are they? These are categories of aquatic animals, and many people are already familiar with fishes, amphibians, reptiles, marine mammals, but less probably familiar with some of these other categories, corals and sponges. People don't tend to think about aquatic birds and insects and spiders as aquatic animals, but these are categories of animals, and if we don't see them, it's very difficult to think about what protections they might need. So some estimates, there's a lot of estimates, indicate there might be more than 2 million marine species, and that's just marine, not freshwater. Over 5,000 were recently discovered, and more were discovered under icebergs as we've had climate change and melting. And when I talk about aquatic animals, I just want to highlight that the freshwater animals are often forgotten. We tend to focus very, very heavily on marine animals, so I just want to lift up the freshwater species. So these are just some pictures of aquatic animals. When I was young, these are not beings that I necessarily understood. Corals and sponges were animals, right? I would have thought of them as more in the plant world, but they come in all kinds of shapes and sizes. They're remarkable, and the diversity is amazing. And maybe because of that, we use them in a remarkably diverse kind of way, right? So we use them in the ways that we use terrestrial animals. So as companions or as pets, for food, for fiber, for their skins and their fur, their oil. We use them to entertain ourselves. We use them to do work for us. We use them in our research, our science, our educational settings, for medicine, as beauty objects and cultural items, as decorations. And we define them as pests sometimes and as wildlife, right? And so how we define them affects how we treat them. So the biggest concerns for aquatic animals right now are in the fishing and the aquaculture context. I'm not going to talk about that because my colleagues on this panel will be addressing those. So I'm going to focus on a couple of other areas we don't talk quite so much about. Aquatic animals are used very heavily and increasingly in the research context. So we have the same kinds of issues for aquatic animals that we do for other animals, in that we have the fundamental irony that they're close enough to be used for equivalencies to have human outcomes for this research, right? To matter for a human medicine or what have you. But they're not close enough to humans to receive similar protections as humans used in research receive. So we still have that fundamental irony. People do not necessarily know that millions of aquatic animals are used every year. We have something called new approach methodologies in the United States. This is supposed to be moving us away from animals in research. However, the aquatic animals are actually counted as a new methodology or an alternative methodology. And so they're counted as an improvement when it's just replacing one animal model for another. So that's problematic. And many scientists think because we're going further down this like taxonomic scale that many of us in the animal protection world don't accept, that that's a good thing, right? That we're using less sophisticated animals, if you will. It just doesn't make sense. It's a waste of time and money when we could be moving to complete true alternatives, right? Using computational biology, human tissue cultures, right? The tissue on a chip or organ on a chip, AI, bioinformatics. We have all these new systems that completely eliminate the need for using animals in testing. So that's what we need to be moving towards, and we need to include reducing and replacing aquatic animals when we're thinking about replacing the other animals as well. So people have already talked so far today about the replacement, reduction, and refinement, the 3 R's, and the fourth R many of us suggest is rehoming, not just destroying these animals when they're no longer used for research. So we can talk more about this later, but there are many, many animals used there. There are many, many animals, again, millions of animals in the entertainment sort of field, if you will. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry, and specifically for aquatic animals. So there's tourism, there's people going out on boats to see these animals, these swim with the dolphin kinds of programs, sort of trying to engage with animals, going to marine parks, the places that Lori was just talking about, and those aquariums where people can watch animals perform, and they're living very, very miserable lives. There's also smaller types of aquariums when we think about like restaurants and offices that have aquariums available for people to watch just the fish while they eat their dinners or go to an office. They have been used increasingly this is not happening, which is really good news, one area of good news in movies, commercials, that kind of thing. So this is an area where we have some good news, but they are increasingly being used in social media, right? People are thinking that this picture, right, depicts what we're seeing more and more of. People think it's great to go and post about their interactions, whether they're sort of daredevilish or some other, like catching fish, right, for just general fishing competitions or something like that, right? So we have the use of aquatic animals, again, in millions and millions of these animals are being used across the globe every year. When we think about aquatic animal companions, they're often left out of the conversation. So in the US alone, 480 million of goldfish are sold annually, and they're bred, right, for both being pets, they're bred for breeding, and then sometimes they're being bred as feeder fish, right, or bait. So we have millions and millions and millions and millions of these animals being bred every year. Just goldfish, right? Hundreds of millions of these animals just in the US. So we have to think about the numbers, because people don't often think that this is an area of large concern. Again, partly because we just don't think about aquatic animals as much as we ought to. Frogs is another example, where 10% of US households, it's estimated, have at least one frog, and that would be well over 13 million frogs, again, just in the US. And we're importing and exporting all of these animals, right, across jurisdictional lines, and that's problematic. All right, so the legal status, people have already talked in this symposium about animals as property, that being a contested and evolving status, that it's not exactly the right terminology for wild animals, that it's not how our indigenous folks around the world see animals. So it's a large conversation that I'm not going to get into, but I just wanted to say it's usually a good starting point when we're talking about aquatic animals, just like when we're talking about other animals, and seeing if they are in that status, which they tend to be from a governmental perspective. But we have a lot of wild animals and it gets complicated. So thinking about their status, right, ends up being a good place to start when we think about how can we protect them. So trying to get folks to see them as valuable for themselves is really, really important, because when we don't, it leads to abuse, neglect, cruelty, and extinction. And so there are different ways now that people are beginning to think about these legal frameworks, right? So we've talked a little bit about environmental law. We've talked a little bit about the rights of nature. I don't think people have referenced legal personhood, both sort of within and outside the NHRP context, so I won't go into that detail. Adding to Kelsey Leonard's list, these are some of the ways in which people are conceiving legally, to some degree, of animals generally, and aquatic animals fit into these categories as well, whether they're property or property plus. And this is whether we want them to be in this category, whether we're pushing for one of these newer categories. So animal rights is a category, animals as rights holders, the Pachamama, the indigenous focus, tribal rights sort of more generically, which is a little bit different, principles of multi-species legality, legal jurisdiction of water. So it goes on, right? We have new ways of beginning to think about aquatic animals. And so it's important to know that these animals have the capacities that they have. We have lots of new studies to say which capacities some of these animals might have. It's important to know that we don't have enough studies to say that they don't have capacities, and we should begin to think about that, because sentience is important, but it may not be sufficient. It may not be necessary for legal protection. But we should be thinking about what the science means for the law, and that it should have legal impact, right? At least when we know some of these scientific capacities, it should matter. So it should result in some legal protection. So the ways forward, right, are thinking that animals are not products, they're not property, they're not ours. We need to stop seeing them as resources. We need to include their interests in decision-making, accept science that shows that they feel and have capacities, reframe our relationships, and develop and use alternatives. And this is just for World Aquatic Animal Day, which is coming up, where we continue to have these conversations on an annual basis. So thank you. And I'll stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Kathy. That was wonderful. All right, continuing now with our aquatic animal panel, I'm thrilled to introduce Amy, excuse me, Amy Wilson. Amy is the research associate, University of Johannesburg, and the executive director of Animal Law Reform South Africa. And Amy is going to be discussing aquacultural law. Take it away, Amy.
Great. Thank you so much,
you.
Professor Schaffner, and thank you so much to the organizers of this wonderful event. It's really an absolute privilege to be here among all of you talking about animal law and about a topic that I care very deeply about and is very complex, but I'll try to do it justice in this short time, aquacultural law. So I'm going to waste no time and jump straight in. For those that aren't familiar, aquaculture broadly refers to the cultivation of aquatic organisms in controlled environments for commercial, recreational, or public purposes. This includes both plants as well as animals, although obviously I'll be focusing predominantly on animals. And just to give a sense, over the last couple of decades, this represents both aquatic animal production through wild-caught fisheries and through aquaculture. There's a lot of numbers of animals and types of animals that are excluded from this, but you can see very clearly that there's been an exponential increase over the past few decades. And what you also might notice is that aquaculture has recently surpassed wild-caught fisheries in terms of the number of animals being impacted. So it's a very important area that animal advocates should be focusing on. And we tend to think of these animals being farmed only for food, which is one of the main reasons, and it's both food for humans as well as other animals. But these animals are farmed too for purposes that aren't food. So fish meal, fish oil, even as companion animals for ornamental purposes and various other reasons. So those are important to recognize that food is just one of the ways that we are farming these animals. And I wanted to give some graphic or visual representation of these systems, but there are many different kinds of systems. There's land-based systems, water-based systems, some that happen offshore, depending on the type of species, the region, and various other factors. And all of these systems have very different consequences and impacts. Some are much more harmful than others. And obviously at the scale that we're doing at the industrialization of this is where we see a lot more of the problem. So essentially factory farming, but for aquatic animals. And while we have at least a good sense of the quantity of terrestrial or land-based animals that we're using, for example, this is a slide of the number of animals just slaughtered per day. This is a huge amount of animals: cows, goats, sheep, pigs, ducks, and chickens. When we think of aquatic animals, we are farming hundreds of different kinds of species. And all of these species have their own unique individual needs. And it becomes a lot more complex to try and regulate and properly account for their welfare. Also, another important thing we do with aquatic animals is we don't measure them by individuals. We measure them by tonnage. So millions of tons. Those were the graphics I showed earlier. People have tried to quantify the scale of the number, and as you can see, it's ginormous. This represents aquatic animals who are caught both in wild-caught settings and who are farmed for food, but you can see there's a big difference between terrestrial animals and aquatic animals. Some have tried to quantify the exact number based on estimations of the weight divided by the average weight of the individuals. And these estimations have showed that between 211 million and 339 million farmed fish are being killed per day. And that's somewhere in the region of 29 billion to 149 billion per year. So these figures are astronomical. And even if we just look at one particular type of animal, shrimps, who are the most farmed, estimates are as high as 76 trillion individuals killed for food every year, both through farming and fisheries. So these numbers are impossible for our human brain to comprehend. And if that wasn't bad enough, we're not just affecting the individuals who are farmed, the direct subject species, other animals are implicated, either animals who are farmed to be food for these animals, the carnivorous species, or who are caught from the wild and brought in to feed these animals. So wild caught fishing and aquaculture are very intrinsically linked. We have animals who then subsequently eat these animals, like companion animals, wild animals who are affected by operations like pollution, migratory routes, and then other animals who are brought in like cleaner wrasse fish to eat off the diseases that are prevalent in these animals. So what does the law say? Well, law and policy is moving forward to increasing these practices around the world. The blue economy, the oceans economy, is very much about exploiting aquatic resources for human benefits, and this includes aquaculture. This is a global push, but we see in individual jurisdictions, like, for example, the US in 2020, this executive order from President Trump about promoting seafood, recognizing 85% of seafood was imported, trying to deregulate the industry, saying that it's unburdensome, that it has burdensome regulations. So removing these regulations for the industry, and that's a push that we see. It has been a national policy priority in the US since the passing of the National Aquaculture Act in 1980, which set up certain structures to regulate aquaculture, recognizing that there's a plethora of different pieces of regulation of importance and that many different agencies have mandates and authority to regulate those aspects. So this is an ongoing thing, and there was an important case in 2020 where NOAA's authority was brought before the courts, specifically their authority to regulate offshore aquaculture in terms of the Magnuson-Stevenson's Act. And there have been several developments since I wrote the entry, which I won't go into, including another executive order and the identification of aquaculture opportunity areas. So it is very much something that's in progress right now happening in the US. And a quick note to say that even the laws that are intended to protect animals in certain instances largely exclude aquatic animals, either by virtue of them being cold-blooded or invertebrates or farmed, or having these practices done to them as farmed animal practices. So we see them also excluded from things like state law and cruelty statutes, either because they're not included in the definition of animals or because they are excluded as farmed animals. So there's very few prosecutions, even in the face of evidence. And it's not just the US. In Africa, there's a huge push to promote aquaculture too. In South Africa, there's an Operation Fikisa, which is about hurry up and exploit the ocean's economy. There's a bill in progress called the Aquaculture Development Bill, which hasn't yet been passed, but is very much about promoting the industry, promoting investment in the industry. And the drafts that have been released show that there's a severe lack and gap when it comes to animal welfare, environmental protections, and even worker safety concerns. And in the Animals Protection Act, which is our main law that regulates cruelty towards animals, aquatic animals are not specifically mentioned, and there's been very few successful prosecutions and none that I'm aware of when it comes to aquaculture specifically. They're also excluded from the humane slaughter protections in our Meat Safety Act. So we see this as a systematic exclusion of these animals. And this is problematic, as we've already heard, that they have these capacities, but because so many welfare issues arise out of aquaculture, farming animals in these intensive situations. And much like terrestrial animals, we see commonalities here, but just a trigger warning, sorry. We see unique things like eye stalk ablation that's done to shrimps to make the females reproduce more. So we see new harms and ways of cruelty. We also see deformities in these animals, and the way that they are killed is very problematic. There's improper stunning, so they suffer tremendously while they die as well. And I've already mentioned that they're excluded from many of the provisions meant to put in place safeguards. There is increasing awareness about this. There's more investigations. There is some public awareness. There are people who are trying to lay charges of cruelty and use other laws to try and bring this some accountability to the industry. One other way that people are doing this is to use public health and environmental law, because seafood is still being promoted as a healthy alternative or a healthy food source in many policies, despite what we know with contamination, toxicity, allergens, diseases, many diseases that are prevalent in the aquacultural industry, and many drugs that are being fed to these animals to try to counteract some of these harms. Of course, feeding animals in large quantities drugs has impacts on the environment, particularly in offshore net pen aquaculture, and a plethora of other environmental harms, pollution, catching other animals to feed them, the risk of escapement when they go into other environments and interbreed, etc. These are just a couple of visual representations of some of the pollution. And of course, because it's intrinsically linked with fishing, all of the harms that come with fishing are also then part of the aquaculture industry, including the suffering of animals that are caught. Other examples, which I don't have time to go into, but important to highlight: labor and worker rights, consumer protection issues, seafood fraud, the impact on First Nation and Indigenous groups, antitrust, competition law, etc. So there are some positive developments. I know it doesn't sound like it, but there are. There's legislative efforts and litigation efforts, strategic litigation to use not necessarily animal law, but antitrust law to break up some of these big companies, consumer protection to create awareness, the use of environmental law like Clean Water Act, EPA, etc. Various others which I won't go into. And finally, some positive legislative developments, bans, preemptive bans on octopus farming, bans on commercial finfish net pen in Washington, and some humane slaughter laws and efforts. So I hope I've given you a good sense of just some of the issues involved in this very complex industry, but I'm happy to answer any questions, and I appreciate your time and attention. Thanks.
Amy, that was great. Thank you so much. And so we are going to conclude our panel with our final panelist here today, Mary Finelli. Mary is president of Fishfeel, and she will be presenting on industrial fishing.
Our organization, Fishfeel, and fishes are by far the largest number of harmfully exploited vertebrate animals, and that's primarily through fishing. We've been fishing for thousands of years without significantly impacting fish populations, largely because it required so much manpower. With the 1950s, with increasing technology and switching from sails to steam power to diesel power, and also having mechanical winches and such, we were able to really start increasing the number of fishes who were caught at a phenomenal rate. Also, the use of radar and sonar, just you can see even with a small ship, you're able to catch so many because you're switching from manpower to mechanical power. And you can see just colossal hauls of fishes. There's also switching to factory ships so they can catch these fish in these huge amounts and process them right on the ship and freeze them, and actually have smaller ships come and bring them supplies and take the catch back to shore. So these ships can be out there for months or even a year or longer. And after a while, though, however, because they're taking so many fishes out faster than they can replace themselves, even with increased mechanical power, engine power, we're catching fewer fish, even with increased effort. The increased effort was not keeping up with the fish population of fishes going down. So you can see over time how the ships are getting bigger and the fishes are getting smaller in number and also actually in size. So it started in the 1950s. This started, and it really peaked in about 1996, and it has been decreasing ever since, the amount of catch. These are the primary ways that fishes are caught: long lines, just lines that can go out for miles with thousands of baited hooks on them. Gill nets, where the animals swim into the net, mile-long nets, and get caught in that. And also trawling, where they're just pulling these huge nets along the ocean bottom, catching whoever happens to be there, and destroying habitat, including corals that can take thousands of years to develop. And you can see also how indiscriminate, not only how inhumane, but also how indiscriminate these techniques are. So also, they're catching, like I said, very indiscriminately. So along with all these other animals that are targeted are non-targeted animals. It's estimated that every year some 250,000 turtles are caught and 100 million sharks, 300,000 cetaceans, and hundreds of thousands of seabirds also. Then there's also ghost fishing, where this huge amounts of fishing material are getting lost at sea. It's estimated that every year something like 1% of fishing gear is lost at sea, and that continues trapping and killing animals and harming habitat. This is an example of how much is lost. It's just huge amount of fishing gear that's lost at sea. It's estimated that some 10% of the plastic pollution in the ocean is due to lost or abandoned or neglected fishing gear. And then there's also illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. This is a big problem. It's estimated that 1 out of every 5 fish who are caught are either caught illegally or not reported or are caught in an unregulated area. And this has, of course, huge effects. Just so many problems with, for example, using explosives to catch fish and fishing in areas where the high seas where fishing is not really authorized or not and can't be regulated. So just a lot of problems. And this is mainly happening through industrial fishing, which is also impacting the smaller scale fishing by the so-called artisanal fishing, smaller fishing communities, and that's leading to just a cruel cycle of overfishing and unemployment and reduced food security and more illegal and unreported and unregulated fishing. Also, because it's getting so expensive now to catch fish, because so many of the coastal fishes populations are being wiped out. These fishing fleets are having to go further and further to catch fish, which is more expensive in fuel and energy for refrigeration and, of course, labor. So to try to cut these costs, there's been just rampant labor abuses and also downright human slavery in the fishing industry. And that's been is very, very prominent in Asia, Thai fishing fleets, but also they're seen in Hawaiian fishing fleets in Ireland, England, and just many countries are involved in this illegal fishing, where actually people are being tricked to go out to sea. And once they're out there, again, these ships can be out to sea for months or years. And they're really at the mercy of these captains, if they have any mercy. And there's reports of no wages, not being paid, physical abuse, rapes, murder. It's just really horrific. And a lot of this catch is being mixed with the other catch, and so it's largely untraceable. So if you're eating seafood, you may be eating slave-caught seafood, and a lot of it is also being used in pet foods. So since 1975, we've tripled the share of fish populations that are being unsustainably harvested. They can't reproduce fast enough to keep up with the numbers being taken out of the oceans. It's estimated that some 93% of commercial fish stocks are already fished at the maximum amount or overfished. And some 37%, about a third of the global fish stocks are fished now at unsustainable levels. A huge problem is fishing subsidies. This slide's a little bit outdated. It's actually now $35 billion globally are used to subsidize fishing, and some 22 billion of that is considered harmful subsidies. So these are things like port construction, building, shipping of fleets that can overfish, fuel tax exemptions. And most of this is going to large-scale fishing, but also some small-scale fishing. And with large-scale fishing, a lot of it is in domestic waters, but also foreign waters where they're going to other countries and taking their fish populations, and also on the high seas, which are largely unregulated. There are some national laws in the US, the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation and Management Act, and in the UK after Brexit is the Fisheries Act of 2020. And in waters that they share with EU countries, the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement. Mostly what these laws do is try to prevent overfishing and conserve the environment. Internationally, there's the High Seas Treaty, which actually just passed in September of this past year, and it's going to go into effect in January, mid-January. And that one of the main things that does is enable countries to create marine protected areas on the high seas. So ideally, these marine protected areas would be no take zones where you wouldn't be allowed to fish, but that's not always the case. Also, the United Nations has Sustainable Development Goals, and number 14 of the Sustainable Development Goals is to conserve and sustainably use the marine environment, marine resources. And 14.6 of that goal is to eliminate harmful subsidies. Also, the World Trade Organization Agreement on Fishing Subsidies that passed in it was adopted in 2022 and it goes into effect, ratified just this past September, and that's to prohibit subsidies that promote or support illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing, or fishing overfished stocks, or fishing on the high seas. But there's a lot of problems with loopholes, possible loopholes on that. Let's see if we can skip these. Now, Amy did address fish farming. But you can see, a huge problem with fish farming is so many wild caught fishes are used to feed farmed fishes and other farmed aquatic animals and other farmed animals. So it's just colossal numbers of wild caught fishes are going towards this. In fact, if you go by number rather than weight, most of the wild caught fishes are going to feed farmed animals. And you can see that it's just because it's so inefficient. Most of these farmed fishes are carnivorous animals. So it takes so many wild caught fishes to say so many pounds of wild caught fishes or so many numbers of wild caught fishes to give you one farmed fish. So it's extremely inefficient. These are just some examples. Amy did address aquatic and aquaculture. These are some examples. This is open pen fishing where they're out in pens in the open sea. And again, as she mentioned, they can escape and compete with wild fishes and also interbreed with them, which can be genetically very problematic. These are some of the problems with aquaculture. Again, pollution, a lot, dead fish. It's very difficult for these fish to survive in these cramped conditions and exposed to all kinds of environmental factors that they can't escape, storms and freezing temperatures and jellyfish invasions. And so there's dead fish and uneaten food and all goes to the bottom and creates these dead zones underneath these pens. And also they're just crawling with coeliacs, these parasites that they can transmit to the wild fishes. So it's, in addition to being very inhumane, it's very environmentally reckless. This is pond fishing, which you can see just how unsanitary that is. And imagine eating an animal out of those conditions. And to try to keep them alive, they use all kinds of antibiotics and parasiticides and other drugs that can remain as residues in the fish that consumers eat. This is tank fishing, indoor fishing. So you can see how extremely cruel this would be for these intelligent and inquisitive and perceptive animals, especially imagine migratory animals stuck in a situation like this. And it's also very energy consumptive and water consumptive. So environmentally reckless there too. Again, because of the selective breeding is causing deformities in these fishes and just suffering with these crawling with parasites.
Mary, as soon as we need to be closing in just a moment.
Sure. There are
Okay,
certification schemes, but they don't address animal welfare, and there's all kinds of problems with these. In fact, there's a new organization, the Aquaculture Accountability Project, just starting, that's addressing many of these problems. In 2010, Victoria Braithwaite, she was a professor of fisheries and biology at Penn State University. She wrote the book, Do Fish Feel Pain? And very eloquently explained that, yes, they do. And since then, there's been a lot more scientific evidence that, of course, fishes are sentient. They have nervous systems similar to mammals. Their behavior indicates that when they are exposed to pain, they respond in ways that indicate they are suffering. They produce their own painkillers, and they quickly learn to avoid painful stimuli. And also, should be apparent that fishes also suffer fear. They're the largest number of harmfully exploited vertebrate animals subjected to some of the worst abuses, and yet they receive the least public concern or legal protection. It's estimated that annually some 1 to 2 trillion fishes are caught from the wild. These are just astronomical figures, and about half of them are used to make fish oil or fish meal. You never have to wonder if the animal on the fish on your plate suffers. They did.
All right, I
Again,
think we're going to need to end.
okay. Could I just say two things? You know,
Yeah.
Amy mentioned that fish is not a healthful food, and it's very true. There's got all kinds of problems. And now we have vegan seafood products. There's plant-based seafood. They're using fermentation to make plant seafood, and also cell-cultivated seafood, and also fish oil. There's alternatives to fish, using fish for omegas. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much, Mary, and thank you to all of our panelists who will now join us for a couple of questions here. This first question, I believe, Kathy, was while you were chatting. How do we hold federal agencies such as the FDA, CDC, NIH, and EPE who conduct animal experiments accountable to their aspirational commitments to phase out animal research?
It's a great question, and it's going to really, the answer depends on obviously which country you're in. This clearly seems to be a US-based question, and right now it's a very political answer. So I would say, at least right now, the techniques that seem to be resonating with the current federal administration are wise use of spending money. So if we're saying that some of the things that they're doing with respect to animal research is wasting taxpayers' dollars, that seems to be resonating. If we say that it's wasting money because we're not getting good results from the research, that's going to resonate. So I think sort of using that wise use of money and reminding the agencies that this is something they've promised to work towards because of these reasons and more reasons, right? They've already said, acknowledge these problems. So trying to remind them of that. The challenge right now, I think, in the US is that the politics are shifting pretty quickly. And so I'm not sure that we can hold anyone accountable right now in the US, but I do think it's a larger question for governments all across the world, right? So how do we make them take account of the information they already have about the harms to these animals and their need to stop subsidizing it, stop encouraging it, stop doing it, and funding the alternatives instead. So I think there's a lot of organizations out there and people who are doing that work, and you can kind of connect with them and pick which strategy you like.
Thank you. Lori, I know you answered a couple of questions, I think, in the Q&A by typing them in. But I did want to, I guess, ask you, given the current trend towards the closing of marine parks, and I think this went to one of the questions, what is the next step for managing the hundreds of dolphins and whales who need to be rehomed?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's the critical issue of the day. So basically what we need to do is all work together, NGOs, scientists, legal entities, governments especially, assist with rehoming these individuals. We are trying to bring sanctuaries online as quickly as possible, and if we had enough, then we can bring all of these animals to sanctuary, but we don't have enough yet. So what we need to do is get creative with ways that we can give them a better life. It may not be the life that they should have had, but it would be better. And I think the one thing I would say is we are all working on this very strenuously. And if I could just put in one thing, I'd say the governments of the world who have done this legislation, Great job. Now finish it. Now help us to bring these individuals to the next phase of their life.
Yes, thank you. Um, Amy, I'll turn to you for a moment. You said you briefly mentioned some of the legislative efforts to challenge aquaculture. Can you perhaps expand on one or two of these?
Sure, thanks. So one that people may have heard of is jurisdictions around the world, and specifically in the US, are taking preemptive steps to ban the practice of octopus farming. So we've seen, for example, Washington State passed a bill, California passed a bill, Hawaii has one in progress, Chile has just introduced a bill, and there's a bill at a federal level to preemptively ban this practice, largely based on the sentience and capacities of these animals and the recognition that it's inherently cruel. So using these as a first step to preemptively ban it, but also then as a gateway to, potentially restrict aquaculture and challenge animals who are similarly intellectual, I think is a very positive development.
Great, thank you. And Mary, what about welfare initiatives for aquatic animals used as food? Are there
Yes,
any?
yes. Well, there are welfare initiatives. In fact, there's quite a bit of research going into that and investment going into that. Some of the problems are, these animals are so diverse that so little is known about their welfare needs. That's one problem. And the research itself can be very, very cruel. And even if they can come up with methods that are less inhumane, it's still ultimately inhumane to use these animals as food. Ultimately, they're all slaughtered, and slaughtering an animal, it can only be considered humane if it's in their best interest, truly. So it's kind of misleading to the public. Like, look at how welfare standards have been trying so hard for terrestrial farmed animals, and look how all the suffering that's going on there and lack of enforcement, even when it's shown that there is violations of the regulations, so little is done, and these things just keep happening. So really what consumers need to know is the only really humane thing to do is not use these animals as food.
Yeah, thank you. Well, we're at our time. This has been a fabulous panel. I hope we now all better see our aquatic animal cousins, as Kathy referred to them. And we will now take a 10-minute break, and we will be back for our final session of the day, looking at some sort of innovative and new things coming down the pike here in
Um,
animal law.
Joan, could I just mention, Joan, one last
Yeah.
thing? Just in November, 70 species of sharks and rays were added to the Endangered Species Act. So that's a good note to end on, though, of course, the Trump administration is trying to take away a lot of the protections of the Endangered Species Act.
Right. Well, thank you so much. All right, we will see you back in 10 minutes. Bye-bye.